Patrick Keller. We are recording round 3 on Podcast Junkie.
Yay!
How are you?
I'm so excited.
I was looking at the last Squadcast recording session, and it was 2019. And I was like, wow, that was a long time ago. But then when I think back to our first recording session, which was 2014 or 15, probably. It's just.
Do you remember what we used then?
We used Skype with Ecamm call recorder, if I'm not mistaken.
Which is probably how I did my show then too.
Yeah, because I was keen on having video from day one. So I need some ideas for the 10-year anniversary of the show, which is in April. It's creeping up, and I'm like, I can't just let it go by. I'm also trying to see if I can convince Jared Easley to let me speak at Podcast Movement on stage about my 10-year journey. So
that would be cool.
Yeah.
Here, I have a story for you that you can use there.
Please do. Please share.
And for audience members, and I'm sure we shared it on one of my episodes with you.
Yeah.
But I was a hardcore Podcast Junkies listener back in 2014 time.
Before it was cool.
We started. Yeah, we started about the same time. You were a few months ahead of me.
Yeah.
But we were pre-serial in 2014, one of those cool peeps. And I was listening, I think it was probably in the summer because I was teaching. And in the summer, I'm a night owl. And I'm always a night owl now as a retired person. And that's when the house is quiet, I put my earbuds in and I really just jam out and binge through podcasts.
Yeah.
And I did then too. And I was listening to Harry's show. I remember it just popped up on my phone. It was like in the middle of the night. And I'm listening. I forget who your guest was. I don't know if you remember, but I'm listening and the interview's going on. And Harry goes, "Oh, hang on. I got a delivery. I got to go to my front door." And so you hear him walk away and go down and get the delivery. And Harry's guest gets a phone call, a full-on phone call, and has a phone conversation. "Hey, what's going on? Yeah, I'm doing this interview." Yeah. And then all of a sudden, a few minutes later, Harry comes back. "Hey, sorry about that." And he's like, "Oh, it's okay. I had a phone conversation, and okay, I'll just edit that out." And I'm listening to it and I'm like, nope, definitely did not edit that out. So I'm messaging Harry as like a giant fan going, "Harry, hurry and edit this."
Yeah, back then I was doing, and sometimes I wouldn't get it all done in one shot. And so I would do a section and then I'd just come back or something like that. Thankfully now it's not on my plate. My team does it for me. So it's hard for me to mess it up. But I typically, these go out almost as one take now, unless there's something like crazy that happens. But I love telling that. So that story has been told several times on this show because I also am keen to remind clients that we work with, students that I coach, and even when I talk about it on the show. That's the beauty of this show, like to keep it real and to remind people that podcasting, although it looks perfect, and with some of these crazy tools like Descript and even easy podcast editing tools like Hindenburg, we can all create really nice, like world-class productions. And you've got the super fancy sound, what is it called? Sound baffle? Is that a baffle? Behind you, the soundproofing.
The sound bed?
Sound bed.
Oh, you mean this stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, soundproofing, I guess is what I would just call it. Yeah.
So I think I'm due for a remodel of this office at some point. So I may turn the desk so that I'm facing the light because I sort of inherited this space temporarily. And then it's exciting. I think we are going to stay here a little bit longer. So I've got some ideas. And I think putting up some panels would be fun.
Well, it's amazing you have that beautiful wood paneling back there. Yeah. It's amazing you're not super echoey right now, but it's
the wood warms it up. The wood definitely, because it's, you think about other rooms, they're just hard surfaces and glass, which is the worst. But I think, overall, we're house sitting, and this is my partner's dad's old man cave. So I'm actually staring at it like he's got a couch, got a TV, he's got a little plug-in faux stove fireplace, which we turn on to because we are in Minnesota. So it gets a nice vibe here. So, I could create a podcast studio if I wanted to and see if anyone wanted to drive out to Excelsior, Minnesota to have a podcast interview with me. It's not at that point. I'm not that big where I can fly people in. But yeah, I think I do get some natural sound editing here. So it's been, so that whole idea of just like being natural and being genuine, that's what I love about the show. And that obviously was the extreme case because real is one thing, but real, like literally like hearing toilets flush and stuff like that, it's probably a bit too much. But
That was some reality show style editing.
yeah. And the reality show style editing is funny because it's always, they edit it for the reactionary moment, for the extreme moment, for the moment that'll get, and then they probably piece together stuff out of order, right? So every time I watch, I don't anymore, but when I did watch some of those shows, some of like, you can just tell it's very manipulated. And that's something, you know, that's sort of like the beauty of these conversations, because as they continue and as they sort of meander, I think they just go where they go. And I've been enjoying Rick Rubin's Tetragrammaton. I don't know if you've heard it. Rick Rubin,
Mm-hmm.
he's like a famous producer. He produced like the Beastie Boys and a whole bunch of bands and stuff like that. So he's like world-class producer, and he's been like around since the early days of like hip hop, and he's produced like Neil Diamond and Metallica or Slayer. So he's got a
Shut
range
up.
of artists, Adele he's worked with. And he wrote a new book recently called The Creative Way or something like that. And he does like these 3-hour interviews, you know, kind of Joe Rogan style, but they're just so mellow. Like he just had Ed Norton on, and they were just talking, and it was just nice to hear. I actually am slowing down the podcast. Normally I just like buzz through them, but I'm doing like 1.2 now. I used to do 1.5 and 2,
Mm-hmm.
but there's something about these conversations that feel like they need to like sit with you for a bit, and then you need to like enjoy them at the pace they were recorded.
It's funny because I slow down or speed up my listening depending on what I'm listening to. Some podcasts are more conducive to speeding up because of the style they do. But if, like you said, if it's something that you're really in the feels, or you feel like, sometimes I feel like a podcast, the host is intending for me to slow down and get the juiciness and experience the silences and
Mm,
all of that. And I can sometimes feel that. And so I will
yeah.
slow it down because I don't want to just listen and, you know, not get the benefit of whatever I'm supposed to get from that. But I also am a speeded up junkie on a lot of podcasts.
I think it's to your point, if it's something that you are learning, or if it's like a more like a marketing or business show, or I'm just trying to get to the salient points and saying, is there something here that I should be listening to? But if it's just a conversation, and if you're in that mood where either you can either have it on the car, or but if you're probably better if you're just sitting on the sofa somewhere and just like sometimes even just close your eyes. I think at one point he had Richard Rudd, who wrote a book called The Gene Keys, which it's like a whole thing based on like human design and the I Ching, and it's a fascinating book I read years ago. But he's into like tea, so they had like a tea ceremony. So they spent like half hour, 45 minutes, and the way it works is like you drink these 7 cups of tea, and you can hear them sipping the tea because you know the quality of the mics is good. But it's just listening to 2 guys drink tea, which is
That's
like
funny.
amazing, and it's really cool.
My audience would totally love that because we pour tea for every episode of
Mm,
our show. In quotes, we
yeah.
pour tea. And
What does that mean when you say you pour tea?
so I am really kind of proud of my intro and outro of my show. And from the beginning, I don't know really if I started all of this from the beginning. I'd have to go back and listen. But pretty early on, I wanted to create a space, an imaginary space for my listeners to listen to my show. My show is about the paranormal, but the show is the Big Séance podcast. So I want to I want you to imagine you're in a seance parlor,
Mm,
from the days of psychics and mediums and
mhm.
spiritualism. And not every conversation is really that about that, but it's, you know, around that. But I want people to imagine that the candles are lit and that it's like a movie scene that you picture in your mind. And sometimes I really do have a candelabra next to me,
Yeah.
depending on if I'm doing something on video. And I really try to create that space. And so we light the candles in the intro. You know, you're walking up to my Victorian home, and you can hear the leaves rustling and the crowing in the background and the wind, and the door opens and welcome, we're lighting the candles, and then at the end, it's time to blow the candles out. Oh, we pour the tea in the middle there too.
Okay.
And then we blow the candles out, and then you leave my house, and it's the opposite. And thanks for coming. And you're back to walking in some creepy woods. And I learned my lesson a couple of years ago because I was just sitting here trying to figure out, just doing some planning for the show. And I realized that I needed to clean up my space. This space was getting kind of junky, and I'm not a super junky person. And I'm like, I need it to be a good place in here and clean. So I'm sitting on the other side in a lazy boy that I have on the other side. And I said, I'm going to take a picture of the space. I've never really shown my listeners my space. So in my Facebook group of listeners and fans, I just shared behind the scenes BTS of the parlor, which, we call listeners come into the parlor.
Yeah.
And I posted it in that group, and I got so much flack. They were so angry because they were like, oh my God, it's been ruined for me for life. And I can never, as if I'm sitting here in this old Victorian parlor with candles and antiques. And I was like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's that theater of the mind where, when done well, and you can paint that picture. And I think that's the beauty sometimes of when you read a great book, because the whole set is in your head. And everyone who reads a book is going to get a different, even characters that are mentioned. You're picturing them, what they look like. And I've read books sometimes that I'm halfway through, and then I'll be in bed, and I'm I think about something that happened, and I'm like, oh wait, that didn't happen in real life. That happened in the book, because it's, you create this vision so much. But I think it's important to do that. And especially because as you start to publish, you get into the dozens and hundreds of episodes, people are coming into your space. People are coming into your world, and they're getting a taste of what it's like to be with you. And I think as a podcaster, I don't know if you've experienced this as well, you tend to be more comfortable in your own skin later on. In the beginning, I've said it so many times, I had my questions, my 6 or 7 questions, my cheesy speed round, and all the stuff you learn in the beginning. And then I just realized I just like talking to people, and I just like conversations. And I think we're seeing, I feel like conversations are making a comeback. I don't know if that's true, if they've always been there, but I just, when I hear podcasts like that, and Joe Rogan has been helpful for the long form conversations, regardless of what, you think of some of his content, but just the fact that is coming back and that's being appreciated. It's interesting to think about experimenting with having the luxury to do a multi-hour podcast. Must be pretty crazy, but I appreciate it. And I think as the show moves into its 10th year, I have to just welcome that and just think about more ways to, how can I have more conversations with people I enjoy speaking with?
I appreciate that. And I also, in my show, have relaxed a lot more, I guess, over the 10 years. I do think there was a benefit of being a teacher when I started, because a lot of new podcasters, if I'm, every now and then I'll help somebody get out of the gate, and I'll help them with some of the ropes and show them and give them some ideas. And they're so worried about hearing their voice or recording their voice. And I'm like, I don't think many teachers have that issue, because we hear our voices in our head all the time, and it's annoying, and we've gotten over it, and the kids have gotten over it. And it's a constant, you just hear it all the time.
Yeah.
And so that was good for me off the bat. I was used to hearing my voice. It didn't really bother me too much. However, I am the opposite of you with just releasing a show with very little editing, because I am a heavy editor. I always tell my guests, I don't allow myself to sound like a dork, and I won't let you sound like a dork either. So I always have that agreement that we will edit any possible stutter so I am a super heavy editor, and I've tried pulling back over the years. And as I learn new techniques and learn to do things better, I dig back in and get even more deep. And I'm like, oh God, I'm trying to pull back, but I can't. So
I think it's just being present in the moment as well. I notice, and this is, I don't know where I picked up this habit, but I always have my finger on the mute button. So if you ever see that go on, it's me clearing my throat, it's me coughing. And I try to instill that in students and clients as well, just to say, hey, just it makes things easier for the editor if you do that. And obviously with tools like Squadcast, you can get multiple tracks. So each one gets its own track. So it's not a big deal in the edit process. But have you ever thought about trying a light edit that's more relaxed and just kind of having that publish a regular one and then just have like a bonus episode that you put like on maybe like on YouTube or something, or just like a place that it's not your regular feed, or maybe just a private episode. I think you can do a private episode or something like that. But yeah, I'd be curious like for your audience to see if the super fans would do it. Say, hey, this is one that's really just almost as is and it's happening in the moment, and there's a couple of like flubs here and there and a couple of mistakes. But I think sometimes it's a helpful reminder to people in the beginning to understand, we're all, this idea of taking imperfect action. I talk about this a lot as well. Like, just move forward. I think the universe loves momentum. So, when we try to make it perfect, we end up like slowing ourselves down.
I get that too. I do go live occasionally, and those are up there on YouTube forever. And then I clean it up for an audio episode.
Yeah.
But that's a good idea because I have Patreon members
for
the show. But also, like, and of course, now that I know how you're going to edit this episode, the audience is going to know that sometimes I am not super eloquent and have a lot of likes, and I say like 57 knows in every episode, and a lot of stuttering type things. And so if any of my listeners are listening to this show, they're probably like, who the hell is this person?
Well, you can share. I'd love for you to share with them, because I'm hopefully making this as much of a relaxed environment for you to. I've used this phrase for the past year and a half, just get hosts, kick back their heels, relax. And just kind of the whole point of the show was just the inspiration was inside the actor studio, because I was always fascinated by I'm like, oh, the actor, he looks like a normal, like chill person. Like, that's so cool. And that was always the intention with the show. So for the benefit of new listeners, new viewers who don't know a lot about your show, I'd love to do a little flashback in time. I know 10 years is a long time to cover, but there's a lot has happened with this show. But can you just sort of just tell the story of how you started the show and a couple of like peaks and valleys maybe, and then we can kind of dig in a little bit there and to present day.
Sure, speed me up if you need to. I started the show, the Big Séance podcast, after having a couple of years of being a paranormal investigator, and before that, actually that came first. After being a paranormal investigator for a couple of years, I was having what I've always referred to as a spiritual shift. I grew up in a Southern Baptist kind of environment and grew up gay and had a lot. I've been running away from the church forever, right? From college on. And all of a sudden was inspired by a book and a TV show and a podcast, a couple other things kind of came in. And then all of a sudden I became this person who had never really read ever for pleasure, and was reading a book a week or more on spiritual or paranormal topics, suddenly lost my fear of death and dying and dogma. All of a sudden I disconnected from a lot of the dogma that I grew up with. And so then the paranormal investigation, and I started the blog, which was the Big Séance, just to have a place to, because, my husband, partner at the time, was not really into that stuff. He was very supportive, but not into it. And then being in a kind of small town environment, conservative area, there weren't a lot of people to have discussions about these things. And so I needed a place to talk about it. And so then a couple of years later, the blog became the podcast. And I'm fascinated by psychics and mediums. That's really kind of where a lot of that fascination started. So I do have a lot of psychics and mediums on, but also paranormal investigation topics, spiritual topics. I don't get too woo-woo, but we sometimes get woo-woo. And it's just I think of it as an ongoing conversation, like imagining you're in a seance parlor. And sometimes we have an interview that is not so much those topics, but it's around there, right?
How did your relationship to things spiritual change over the years? Because I like telling people, like at this point, I tell people you can't outwoo me because I've been down all the rabbit holes.
I know
Like,
you have.
and I go pretty deep on like a bunch of stuff, like light workers, channeling, mediums, like tarot, astrology, like ancient Egyptian civilizations. So, like, yeah, I'm going down all those rabbit holes. But did you feel a shift for you? And this is sort of a multi-part question because I'm thinking about, you mentioned like maybe this fear of death that you have, which led you to look into these things. And have you learned more about like what's quote unquote out there in terms of like, or aspects of spirituality that you maybe weren't looking for when you started, but then you sort of opened up as you started to have more and more of these conversations?
Sure. I can tell you something that hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is I am as close to 100% confident in knowing that there is life after death and there's something on the other side. And what that looks like and what that is fascinates me. There's whole episodes of just me bugging people about, no, really, what do you think life's like on the other side and
That's
what's going
awesome.
to happen and what, da, da, da. So that has not changed.
Yeah.
What has changed in the kind of our physical world here, mediumship, paranormal investigation, a lot of the woo stuff, I've gotten more skeptic about. A lot of people peddle things and you have to look into it, right? Especially there's some scary conspiracy theories out there, and why that gets wrapped up into the paranormal world, I don't know, but that always kind of concerns me. But then also, I would consider myself, there's this paranormal side of things and a spiritual side of things. They don't always meet in the middle, but they're kind of in the same family. On the spiritual side, we have to be careful because there's a lot of cult-like things that people get sucked into on the spiritual side. That has always concerned me for my audience, right? So I'm always pre-scanning what I have on my show because I do not want to introduce something that could be a danger to someone.
Yeah. Some like negative
So
energy or something like that.
yeah, well, like
Yeah.
this whole conspirituality idea. And
What's that? How do you define that?
well, there's a podcast and a book called
Okay.
Conspirituality that I've read and is really awesome. And I wish they would come on my show because I've contacted them like 11 times. I really would like to have them on my show. But, just a lot of, they go down the road of, I'm not thinking of the correct term, but, a lot of anti-vax stuff and a lot of cults and yoga, a lot of the scary yoga stuff, cults, and I can't think of any of the
Yeah.
names.
Just like darker rabbit holes, if you will.
Yeah,
So
and so I'm reading that book going, every time I turn the page, I'm like gritting my teeth going, "Oh my
yeah.
god, am I gonna read about somebody that's been on my show? Oh my
Yeah,
god."
yeah. But I think it's helpful because the other aspect of that, with everything that's happened and people have awakened to post COVID, is this idea of labeling, separating, calling people out, quote unquote, canceling, not saying the right word, not being allowed to say words we used to say. Like all this stuff is coming together. And I think what's important is this idea of discernment, and also figuring out what resonates with you. And a lot of this in spirituality, we talk a lot about take what resonates and discard the rest. So you could read something about something spiritual and be like, I don't believe 90% of this, but that 10% in there, that's really, I could apply that in
Yeah.
my life. So that's really helpful. But it's also this idea of being able to hear someone's opinion on something, disagree with it without being disagreeable, and just learn to, like, we're not all going to like the same stuff, agree on the same stuff, vote for the same person, care about the same stuff in life, and I think that's okay, and I think for a long time, it's just like we're looking for places where we can point to people and say, oh, you said that one thing, I hate you now. Like, and obviously I mentioned Joe Rogan because he like says one thing and the people like latch onto that. But I'm like, I've heard some amazing conversations on that show which really have changed my perspective on life. And I'm just like, I give him credit for that. So it's this idea of like, everyone has value. Like I could learn something from anyone, even people that on the face of it, I'd probably disagree strongly with. And I think opening ourselves up to be more patient and more open to understanding, like, we don't have to like agree on everything everyone says. And I think if we could just move into that space, we could just be more amenable to each other. And I think conversations like this help us open up, even, to the point of maybe having people on the show where it could be a topic that you're not familiar with, that you disagree with, or that you're maybe even against. And just, I think it's a helpful skill to learn how to be able to manage those, because sometimes, if you're not ready, some of these conversations can be very triggering. And so
I will tell you, Harry, I am getting better at that.
Yeah.
However, I struggle. Yeah. I struggle with Sir Rogan and a little bit, and I struggle when it comes to bigotry, racism, hate. And so I've spent a long time, and as an educator too, I've spun a lot of wheels trying to introduce people to, well, here's maybe what you don't understand. Let me try to explain it to you. And I can say there have been some minds that I have changed, I feel, or at least changed a little, but most of the time, they don't change. But I do. I have a hard time with that, and I hopefully can grow. At the same time, I kind of don't know if I want to grow. Like if of a lot of these racist, bigoted attitudes, I've learned, I guess, I'm trying to learn to just peace out and not even go there.
Yeah.
But I struggle with that. I think I'm getting better, but there's that side of things too.
So talk a little bit about your podcast journey, because we chatted a week or so ago and you were talking about how you had to put the show on hold. So this is relevant for anyone who's considering podcasting, who is podcasting, who's been podcasting like you and I have been, closing in on the 10-year mark. It's a grind. And if you do the math on my episodes, I'm at 330-ish. So over 10 years, you can tell that I haven't been consistent with a weekly podcast. So there's that. But I'm curious what that journey's been like for you. You were consistent for a while, and talk a little bit about your mindset, what you're going through internally in terms of making those decisions.
So for the biggest part of the life of my podcast, it's been an every other week show. When I first started, for, I don't know, several months, I was a weekly show, and trying to do that and teaching at the same time and being a paranormal investigator nerd, behind the scenes, that was a lot. Right.
Yeah.
And so most of the time it's been an every other week thing. And podcasting is a passion of mine, and I love following it. For a while, most of the podcasts I listened to were podcasts about podcasting, which, makes people outside of this space giggle.
Yeah.
But no, it's hard to be a full-time public school teacher, especially COVID on was really rough in the education space. And I think in some areas of the country, it was rougher. And, we were thrown into the wolves for a while, and masking and having 700 kids in a building, and the effects on our kids of the political environment and the divide, and just the things got off the chain a little bit, and mental health was for a lot of teachers. And I mean, a lot of teachers have been leaving the field and deciding that, mental health is a big concern. So the last school year, I discovered that I had the ability to purchase some years. I know not everybody can do this, but I was encouraged from the very beginning of my teacher career to start a 403B, which at least in my state is like a 401k for like public workers, state workers, things like that. And so I had been doing that. And my first, well, I guess I'll cut it short. I bought several years using that to get to retirement. So it is a little odd that I'm going on 46, but a 45-year-old retired person, it's a little weird. However, there's a lot of things I miss about education. There's a lot of things I miss about my kids. However, when you get out of it, it's been such an adjustment. Like, I've had to purge some things. I've realized how toxic my environment was a lot
Mm,
for years,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when you all of a sudden get on the other side of that and some space goes by, oh my gosh. So it's been a really cool change, but it was an adjustment. Anyway, I'll backtrack a little bit because in planning my retirement, just planning my retirement in the last school year, planning for your retirement stresses stresses you out almost as much as, a full-time job. So I told my audience, and it was hard, and I was kind of burned out too in a lot of ways. I put out a special episode and I said, I don't know what this is. It's at least a pause. It might be a hiatus. I'm not sure, but stay tuned, right? And so for like 9 months, I was on a hiatus while I figured it out. And then I got retired, purged everything, got off some mental health medication to try to figure out, now that I don't have that stress,
Mm,
what's life like without that. And I'm still
mm.
trying to figure out if I'm liking that without it or if I need to go back. But after a couple of months, I was like, okay, I'm ready to get this podcast back going again. And I came back and was weekly, just like the first time. I was weekly for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then I was like, I kind of like that every other week thing. But I did find, and to all the podcasters out there who are talking about downloads, and it's funny, so many things changed in those 9 months that I was gone. It's like I picked the worst time to be on hiatus because all the AI discussions
Oh
and
yeah.
all and this Apple podcast change thing, and my downloads were hit. Like, they were hit. Everybody always says, don't ever just like stop because, your audience will change a little bit. And you're like,
Well,
and then I did
part
it.
of it is the way apps work, I think sometimes too, what they're doing, and this is
Right.
the Apple podcast related, but if you don't listen to downloaded episodes over at some point, I think some of these apps, and I mean, really it's just Apple and Spotify, but I think Apple, they may unsubscribe you to the show, or
Right.
yeah, so they're trying to make sure that
So I
people,
don't know how to
yeah,
explain it, but yeah. And it's hard to know exactly why, because also not just from my hiatus, but, also everybody in general is talking about lower
yeah,
downloads now. And so, I mean, I've learned, coming from a stats junkie too, in the early days where I would
hmm
refresh every
hmm
hour and have a fascination with that. I'll go months without even looking.
yeah,
So, I mean, I try
same.
to just ignore all of that stuff now and just do what I do, and whatever is going to happen is going to happen.
How would you describe your relationship to your podcast? Because it's interesting. Like, if I just stopped, I mean, naturally, like, it's what we do. We have an agency, we produce shows, we do it for clients. I have a second show, and of all things, vertical farming. So I'm just wondering, if there was like a podcast switch and I turned it off, there'd be a big hole in my life. Like, I probably would, I mean, obviously you get that question all the time. What would you do if money was not an object? I'd probably be DJing, I think, to be quite honest. That was my first passion, and still
Yeah.
is, like house music and stuff. So I think about those things, but like all that to come around and kind of rephrase the question, like, what's the relationship to this podcast? It's 10 years, right? So it's a big
Yeah.
part of your life. And, you did stop it for a while, but, do you think about that? Like, your audience and everything you've built up over the years?
Well, the benefit of having that group of listeners,
Yeah.
on Facebook, is that I can, it's a very nice community. We've had very few issues that a lot of groups have, social
hmm
media
hmm
groups. And so I feel like I can trust them. And we have ongoing conversations all the time that are sometimes not 100% related
Yeah.
to the show. And I feel like having them kind of helped me there. And I don't always get feedback on a regular basis from my listeners, but I got a lot of feedback over those 9 months of being gone.
Mm. What did you do to keep the group engaged? Because obviously, if it's around the podcast and you've got the Patreon group and people are paying you, that's obviously coming out of their account
That
every
went on
month.
pause.
Okay, it
That
did.
went on pause, and there was an honest discussion with the folks there too. And I actually got a lot of argument for that. A lot of people didn't want to be on pause. They were like, don't pause me. This is what
Okay.
and I'm like, what? That's weird. But yeah, I paused everybody. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion that happens in that group even without me.
Yeah.
And so I just chime in on everybody else's stuff. But one thing that I did miss, and this is weird, even like probably just as much as the discussions and, the interviews and things, was the behind the scenes editing and the
Mm,
producing of something. I really learned that I've always thought it was my jam, but I really missed that. And so that's why I kind of ended up jumping into this being a contract editor
mm,
space. And I've been
okay.
doing some editing for some other people. And so, I mean, I wasn't doing that during the 9 months, but I missed that too. I'm
Yeah.
kind of jumping all over the place.
That's fine.
I'm
I mean,
sorry.
I think that's where your mind goes when you think about it. What I was going to
Edit this
ask.
out, Harry. Edit this out.
No, it's not going to get edited. That's the beauty of it. I think what's interesting, I've been thinking about this, and this is related to age as well, because I'm 53. Am I 53? Yeah. At some point you start losing track and you're like,
You're that
what
age.
year is it? But I'm thankful that I'm probably not the close to being in the best shape of my life, because there's some old school weights here, and I've been like working out 3 days a week and just taking care of myself and being conscious of staying in shape. But you always think about the future, and I would come back to this idea of like all this digital stuff that we're creating, all these podcast episodes. You may be the best person to ask this, and we were talking about what happens when we pass on. And do you think about like all your stuff? Who's like, do you bequeath it? Do you it just goes off? I think about these phantom like Facebook pages and profiles of people that have passed on, and who monitors that? Do they go? Sometimes my mind wanders and I'm just like, what happens? Do people just read these people's like social accounts, or just do they visit them? Is it just like a graveyard? Do you ever think about that stuff?
Well, especially in the last couple of years that everybody, and this drives me crazy
Yeah.
because it makes me want to stab my eyes out, but all these content creators having to, or feeling like they have to also have a TikTok and have an Instagram and go live on YouTube. And I think some of us just, sorry, I'm not going to, I
No,
mean, I
thank you.
try a little bit, but I'm not going to be that content creator,
Yeah.
no matter
Yeah.
how hard you tell me. But you think about all of those accounts from people, and with AI, also AI grabbing what actor just had their
Oh
voice grabbed by
yeah.
some
Yeah. Yeah.
company.
The
And
deep fake stuff is out of control
yeah,
now. It's
where they
crazy.
use like a podcaster, that's an AI, heaven, because you can take anybody's podcast and learn their voice from thousands of hours
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
episodes. And so that kind of worries me, but I have had the conversation with my husband, and I've told him, unless you're poor at that moment, you need to, there's the account that you can choose, at least through Libsyn, that where they'll just store your stuff.
Yes.
You're not adding anything to it, but it's just there. And I'm like, I want my shows to stay there,
I would. Yeah.
at least until people forget about me.
Yeah. There's that phrase that people say, or there's some famous saying that says, there's two deaths: that when you actually die, and then the last time someone mentions your name.
Dude, do you know how many times I think about that? I've had grave adoptions. That's one of the cool things I did over the years of
Grave
vlogging,
adoptions. What's that?
where I would go, and I did it for 2 or 3 years in a row. In the fall, I went to my favorite cemetery. I mean, I love the big, huge garden cemeteries, the enormous ones and they're just beautiful. We have one in St. Louis here, but then also just the forgotten cemeteries. You
Mm,
drive by and you see a forgotten cemetery that's like hidden.
mm.
And so I devoted myself to like 2 or 3 years in a row finding like 2 grave sites at each cemetery that looked forgotten. Like, I obviously didn't pick a newer grave that someone might be taking care of, or if I see a grave that already has flowers on it or
Yeah.
something like that, obviously they've got someone who is remembering them and whatever. But I pick an older gravestone, and I did it just by kind of intuitiveness and just kind of went there, didn't look at the name,
Wow.
anything. And the first year was really special. I ended up picking in two separate cemeteries. I ended up picking a little boy who had died in like
Mm.
the early 1800s, I
Wow.
think, mid 1800s, and a little girl in another cemetery. Slightly different time periods. They weren't kind of in the same time period, but they both died really young and obviously like forgotten, right?
Wow.
And so I did a lot of genealogy and would go weekly. I went weekly and straight up had conversations with them and was
Wow.
talking to them about what I was learning about them and their family. And
Man.
I podcasted about it. And so I would tell them, I'm like, I don't know if this matters to you, if it matters, or if you care that I'm kind of bringing your life back up and discussing and learning about you, but I hope this helps and I want people to remember you. And so that has always been
Wow.
played like whenever I do an episode about some individual who played a role in spiritualism or whatever. I sometimes wonder, I'm like, do they know and do they appreciate us kind of pulling their name back up? And is it something that affects them on the other side? Do they feel when people 100 years later, they didn't know, not
Yeah.
connected to them?
I love that. And what I'm also a fan of time travel. I'm just like obsessed with time travel and this idea of like multidimensional realities and everything happening at the same time. Have you ever seen Interstellar?
Oh yeah.
Like that Tesseract moment, or like at the end when he's in all the places at once, and it's happening at the same time. Like I
Oh,
firmly
you're one
believe,
of those.
like that's all happening. So time is not linear because we think about it has to happen in this way. So I think about that stuff. I really feel has a resonance. And when you were saying that, I'm like, oh yeah, that for sure is putting something out into the ethers. That's like a positive thing because, that somewhere that energy signature of that person is happy that you do that. I think that's amazing. And so do you go specifically to older cemeteries or is just your local one and you just browse and look for like older tombstones or
Typically,
neglected?
and I
Yeah.
haven't done it for
Yeah.
several years,
Yeah.
right? But in the 3 years that I did it, yeah, I typically gravitate toward a smaller, well, not necessarily smaller, because there are a lot of huge old cemeteries, but I try to find the oldest part of a cemetery,
Yeah.
right? And, sometimes you'll find a grave that is knocked over or the headstone is missing. One of the graves that I look after was one of those where the headstone was completely missing. I had no clue who it was, but I went there weekly. I usually brought something every week.
Wow.
Like I would go to the grocery store and get, cheap flowers,
Yeah.
or like I would go get a little pumpkin
Yeah.
or something, and I would drop something off at each grave just to, as people walk by, they might see that and be like, oh, okay, somebody is thinking about that person or
Sure.
whatever.
Sure.
But yeah, I always try to go to the ones that are obviously not tended to. If I was a cooler person and maybe, better at like fixing graves, or
Yeah.
there are people out there that go and repair graves
Mm.
and, or, raise money to recreate a headstone that has been destroyed or damaged or whatever. I'm not that cool. Like I didn't go and like fix things, but at least I was there. I brought gifts and I chatted and
That's amazing. I
tried to
love that.
bring their life story back a little bit.
That sounds like something you could probably encourage people to do on the regular. And of course, as a
I
podcast,
have,
you're like,
yeah.
oh, this could be a podcast, but it could be a user generated content. So like people could do it. They could tell you, they could submit their stories and you could have like tomb
Oh,
stories.
that's a great idea.
Or just,
Yeah.
we could call it something different, but like maybe we will bubble it up. So anyone's listening, either Patrick's audience or mine, if you need a new podcast idea, but it could be something where everyone does it in their own neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And then they'll just submit, I found this person and this is the latest. And it could be like resurrected memories or something like that. Of course, now I'm getting into like the marketing mode here, but I'm thinking about this. It is a beautiful idea because when you think about the families, it could have been the child that died and then the parents passed away and then there was no one else in the family. And then that's it. There's no more memories of that person.
I purchased some this is another super nerdy hobby collection of mine. I started collecting old yearbooks from my high school,
Oh, wow.
a small town outside of Kansas City, Missouri. that has a big history. You know, at one time it was one of the largest cities in Missouri before Kansas City was a thing. And it's a river town, and it's also a Civil War battle
Mm,
town.
lots of energy
And
there.
yeah. So like it was one of the first cities probably, you know, in the Midwest to have what we would call a, you know, more classic high school, right? You go from the one room schoolhouses and stuff, and then there's one building where you have more of what we know as high school. And in the early 1900s, they even started having yearbooks. Like I couldn't believe that they had yearbooks in like 1910,
Wow.
1920, and that they were still around. And I purchased 5 or 6 yearbooks from the 20s, early 20s to late 20s, and discovered that they were owned by a teacher from that high school, the same teacher.
Wow.
And also discovered that teacher taught from which when she was a teenager, she taught in a one-room schoolhouse situation, and she taught all the way through the 60s.
Whoa.
So like I taught 21 years and feel like I'm ragged and barely survived, and just it was crazy. And you think about all the changes in education
Yeah.
from one-room schoolhouse to the 60s,
Yeah.
right? So anyway, I did a lot of genealogy on her and blogged about that, and felt a connection as a teacher
Yeah.
and as someone who went to that high school, right?
Wow.
Different building at
Sure,
that
sure,
point, but
sure,
same, right?
sure.
And so there were so many connections. And I even took that research and displayed it and shared it with my students of a 1 year. And we talked about her, and I showed her pictures and showed her, I found an older picture and a younger picture.
Yeah.
And my kids were kind of fascinated, and we talked about it a little bit. And I'm sure it seemed weird to them, but they were learning about my passions as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And there were a number of weeks where I felt like I felt her in my home.
Mm.
And also, we had a few moments at school, and the kids talked about it for years. And that was 10 years ago. But even my recent kids will talk about the ghost of Mrs. Owen. And because we had a few moments where it was like, and the kids are like, "Do you think that's Miss Owen?" And I'm like, "I don't know. She must be checking to see what, you
Yeah.
know, we're up to, or appreciating that we're talking
Yeah, of
about her,
course.
or curious about what school is like in the 2020s."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because it sort of makes me feel better about this idea of like being lost forever when no one thinks about you anymore. But like these little things hopefully will encourage the listener and the viewer to maybe see where in their lives they could do that. And whether it's looking back at old yearbooks or looking back at photo albums, and just putting a positive energy in that moment and just sending that person just like love or something like that. Just something as simple as that. I think there's something to be said, and I think that's a good thing.
I know what I
Yeah.
left something out, because
Yeah.
this is the part that I thought about before I told that story. Is I went back and tried to find as many people as I could find in the town that I grew up in that would have memories
Oh,
of
yeah.
having her as a teacher
Yeah.
in the 60s. And believe it or not, there weren't a lot of people that I could find that even remember her. I know my grandma and grandpa were alive and went to that school. So did
Yeah.
my parents after that point. My grandpa had died, so I couldn't really ask him. My grandma didn't remember.
Okay.
But I knew where she lived. I found her house. I have
Wow.
pictures of her house that's still there, a little gingerbread looking house. She lived there at a time when teachers, especially women teachers, were not allowed to be out of the house at a certain
Oh, yeah.
time, or
Wow.
have, gentlemen callers. And, there were so many dumb rules about
Sure.
women teachers. But anyway, I did find a couple of people. Some person said, "Oh, yeah, I used to have, when I was a kid, I had a newspaper route, and she was always on my newspaper route. And I remember I would see her sometimes at the door, and she was an older woman at that time." But he remembered her. And then someone else remembered her as a teacher that I talked to, and said she was just very quiet. And that would have been when she was older. She didn't like stand out too much, but she had a pen pal club that apparently the kids loved. They loved having their pen pal club. And so she did that, above and beyond teaching. So that was interesting to discover that there weren't a lot of people that remembered her. And it's not like this was ancient history. It was just there are people alive that knew her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And already there weren't a lot of people that remembered her. And that made me kind of sad.
Yeah. It goes by quick when you think about like even just looking back at 100 years, like how just memories disappear. So it's been an interesting thing to think about as you were telling that story. And I think everyone's going to appreciate and just take more solace in knowing that we should treasure the memories we have, because sometimes as we get older, we're the only ones holding on to them, and we're the keepers of that lineage. We talk about ancient Native Americans talk about 7 generations. They think about the impact of stuff 7 generations forward and back, but also a lot of, in the past, everything was oral history, orally transmitted, and you would tell the stories and tell the stories and tell the stories. And I think we've lost that. But thankfully, through podcasting and archiving, and I think we'll have a lot of that available. So I'm really appreciate you coming on and being open to just talk about whatever's coming up for us in this moment, because I think it's weird how it happens sometimes, because I'm just like, I come across your name or your profile on Facebook, and I was just in that moment, I'm like, I think we're just due for a catch up. And so I want to thank you for coming on and sharing an hour again with me. And I enjoyed this format because, like I said, if this was a podcast conference, we'd have a couple of minutes in like a hallway and be like, hey, we got to catch up and like maybe talk. But there's nothing like slowing down here and introducing new people to you as well, because there may be people who haven't heard the first couple of episodes. So I'm always grateful. And I want to thank you just publicly again for being a super supporter of the show early on when it was like, you're wondering if anyone's listening. And thank you for being
Well, I appreciate you because I was your first guest who was on as a listener. I wasn't on your show because of my show or anything I had done. I was on your show as a listener, which was a really cool opportunity back then. Yeah.
So for folks who want to connect with you and learn more about Big Séance and what else is going on in your world, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
BigSeance.com is my website, and something you want to send me an email, that's on there too, but patrick@bigseance.com. So that's it. I'm also on, since retirement, I have been figuring out this Instagram stuff. I'm a true Gen X who is getting into Instagram now that the cool kids are leaving Instagram and going to TikTok. I finally found Instagram. So Big Séance is on Instagram and on Facebook as well.
We'll make sure all those links are in the show notes as well. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it, my friend.
You rock. Thank you.